Welcome, everybody, to Budget 2025. We will get started. Great. Do we have any regrets today?
Councillor Longo.
Great, thank you. Any declarations of pecuniary interest from our members? Seeing none, wonderful. Then we have consent items and confidential consent items 3 and 4. Any movers? Okay, thank you, Mayor Burton. All in favor? And that passes, although we've got some sleepy arms going up. All right, very good. Great, let's move to the main meat of it. Number 5, discussion item number 1. 5.1, and I believe that we have an introduction from CAO Closey.
Good morning, Chair Grant and members of the Budget Committee. Can you hear me all right? Okay. I am pleased to introduce the 2025 budget today. In June, the Mayor had given us direction as staff to prepare an operating budget at an overall rate of 4% or lower. The budget being presented over the coming days is the culmination of a tremendous amount of work by staff who have developed reasonable budget projections for what is a growing municipality. In the presentations to come, you'll hear a lot of good news and exciting projects that we have in store for 2025. Financially, we remain in a very strong financial position. There are trends, though, that we need to pay attention to so that we can stay in this strong position. On the operating budget, staff have gone to great lengths to ensure that we can achieve the Mayor's direction. Typically, the operating budget is consistently under pressure as increases in the base budget are typically above inflation. This is particularly challenging in years where we're opening new services, and it leaves little room to consider introducing new programs and changes in service levels. We have spent several years focused on efficiencies, as this council is well aware of. As your Director of Finance indicated last year, we've really wrung the towel dry in terms of the opportunities for efficiencies. Our drive for technology improvements provides for a greater level of customer service, a greater ability to measure our performance measures, and enables us to continuously improve the services in which we deliver. However, these changes we have found typically come at a higher cost, higher salaries for specialized staff, and sets a higher technology and security costs. These advancements do not typically result in a cost savings. So Oakville is a thriving and growing municipality. People here come here to raise their families and access our great programs and services. With this growth comes increased service requirements that challenges our capacity to deliver. I would like you to pay particular attention to the capital reserves as you hear the presentations over the next couple of days. Since the pandemic, costs have substantially increased, while sources of revenue have been impacted by changes in legislation, particularly the development charge changes. Our asset management program, while excellent to understand our needs going into the future, has also identified additional costs so that we can make sure we can maintain and replace our current infrastructure. We are, as I've said, a growing municipality, which will require facilities, services, and programs in order to serve our future residents and businesses. We are not immune to the challenges of climate change, the economic impacts that all of us are experiencing, the social unrest that seems to be prevalent in our communities, affordability, and other matters that municipalities are facing currently. Going forward, the town will need to consider priorities, making choices so that you can balance when and where and what you want to deliver. Making these careful and thoughtful choices will allow us to continually deliver the right facilities, the right programs to the community while maintaining a strong financial position. On the positive side, the town is well positioned to take advantage of increased revenue with both OAC, which has clearly demonstrated that they have a growing opportunity to increase financial returns to the town, and the town's MDC, which will also begin to provide some financial benefits. Through council direction, staff have also been exploring other financial tools, such as the stormwater fee, and other planning tools to ensure that we can continue to provide a great future for our residents and our businesses. And lastly, the town will always be exploring grants and loans from other levels of government, which seems to be increasingly important these days. So the continued and long-term view and a prudent approach to our financial sustainability, which actually has served this town very well to date, can very much be the measure to a continued success in the future. For today, you're going to hear, the Budget Committee will hear an overview of the draft budget from our Director of Finance, Jonathan Vanderheiden. That presentation is going to be followed by Julie Clark on the CAO budget. And following that, Commissioner Nancy Selly will provide a presentation on Corporate Services Commission. So that on Thursday, you're going to hear 3 presentations. First from the Acting Commissioner of Community Development, Ralph Kaminsky, the Commissioner of Community Infrastructure, Phoebe Fu, and the Commissioner of Community Services, Paul Damaso. So with those brief introductions, Chair Grant and the members of the Budget Committee, please welcome Jonathan to provide you that overview of the budget.
All right. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you this morning, and thank you for the introduction, Jane. So I'm excited to be here to talk about our 2025 staff-prepared draft budget, and hopefully the slides can come up in just a minute. There we go. All right, so I have a little agenda for us to organize the various budget topics that we're going to be discussing this morning. And you'll see this slide come up a number of times as we move through the different agenda topics. So we're going to start with the budget process and just a reminder of some of the different components of our budget process here at the town. So up on the screen right now is the timeline and approval process that we are going to use for this year's budget, or at least the public portion of this year's budget. I will go through this slide in a bit more detail to ensure that all members of the Budget Committee and the public are aware of where we're at and what our next steps are. And as I do this, I'll also add some commentary on what happens on the internal side of things as we build the budget in-house here at the town of Oakville. So this budget approval process is quite similar to the process that we used last year, which was the first year under the Strong Mayor budget approach. And this approach also means that we have a staff-prepared budget, and then the mayor will table his budget later on in the process. So consistent with prior year, we have a number of opportunities for public consultation throughout the process, something that I know is important to council. And these items can be seen with the gold bordered box on the screen in front of you. So if you direct your attention to the first box in the flowchart, you can see that the external budget process kicked off with the budget forecast report that was provided to the committee earlier this summer. However, internally, the budget process is already well underway at this point. In spring, asset management starts working with departments on their infrastructure renewal projects, and departments also begin to work on their business cases. Then throughout the summer, finance, in conjunction with asset management, meet with the departments to talk about their budgets, their work plans, and their upcoming projects. This work takes a fair bit of effort as we try to build as accurate and realistic a budget as possible, utilizing past experience and upcoming expectations about our program levels and outcomes, as well as council's strategic priorities. During the same time, members of the Budget Committee had the opportunity to consult with residents on the budget, and you can see that in the first gold bordered box in that top row. As part of that process, there was a Budget Committee meeting on September 26, where you as a committee provided some questions and feedback to staff for the 2025 budget. Between the commissioner presentations that are coming up later today and on Thursday, as well as a staff report that will be on the agenda for November 14th, I think that we will have addressed all of the questions you raised at that meeting. During the month of September and into early October, staff are extremely busy working on the staff-prepared budget. The finance team, along with the members of the town's management team, directors, and commissioners, work through each department's budget, evaluating the assumptions, considering the various initiatives, and looking at the capital forecast. Finance then compiles everything together to present to the executive leadership team for their review and consideration, as not every request can be included in the budget. Once everything has been finalized, staff work on pulling it together in the budget book, which is available to you. I think most of you already have it. And it's also available to the public online today. During this time, the commissioners are also busy pulling together their presentations that you'll see following my presentation and on Thursday. And so that brings us to the next row in our chart, which involves more public consultation. So following the budget presentations this week, Budget Committee members have the opportunity to hear from residents on the draft budget. This can be done individually by each councillor. However, there are two specific meetings that have been set aside to hear from members of the public, and you can see that in the next gold bordered box. Residents or community groups are invited to come and share their thoughts on the budget, and in keeping with our meeting procedures, we do ask that they register in advance for those meetings. They're being held on November 12th in the morning and November 14th in the evening. And these two meetings also serve as an opportunity for you as members of council to inquire of staff on anything related to the budget. Now, I did skip over the green bordered box in this row, and this is something new that we've added to the budget process for this year. During the week of November 4th, we are offering 3 sessions to you as councillors to come to Town Hall to meet with members of our leadership team and talk about the budget. We've timed this a couple of weeks after the presentations and after the release of the budget book so that you have some time to digest all of the many pages of information that we provided you with today. Our hope is with these sessions is that it will give you the opportunity to ask any questions you might have or seek any clarity that you might need as you look at the budget and as you engage with residents on it. And of course, you will still have the opportunity to ask any questions in a public forum at the Budget Committee meetings as well. Moving now to the last box in this middle row, you'll see that we have our final meeting of the Budget Committee on November 28th. At this meeting, staff will respond back on any questions that have been asked of us, and then you as committee will have the opportunity to pull together your thoughts along with those that you've heard from residents and provide any recommendations to the mayor before he releases his budget. And that brings us to the next row, and you can see the first date there is December 5th. And that is when the mayor will present his proposed 2025 budget at a special council meeting. The items on the bottom row are all in dark blue as they are all full council meetings. 1 week after the mayor presents his budget, we have another special council meeting where council can receive public delegations on the mayor's proposed budget. And again, that's why it's got that gold border around that box. And then finally, we have the last box on this slide. On December 19th, there will be a special council meeting at which the 2025 proposed budget will be considered. And I'm actually going to switch to the next slide to outline briefly, just for a moment, what may happen at that meeting and what the next steps might be. So this is the budget decision flow chart that we used last year as it pertains to strong mayor powers. So last year, you may recall that our town solicitor, Doug Carr, did a presentation on that legislation, including what the impact is for the budget process. And this flow chart stems from that presentation. So the process is actually quite straightforward. However, I think it's good to touch on it briefly so that everyone is aware of it. The flow chart works by following the gold arrows for yes situations and the blue arrows for no situations. So beginning at the top, you'll see that the head of council is to provide a proposed budget, and this is what the mayor is planning to do on December 5th. And that also starts the clock ticking on the timelines as per the legislation. Once Mayor Burton presents his budget, council has 30 days within which to pass any resolutions to make any amendments to the budget. We have scheduled a meeting for December 19th, should council wish to propose any such resolutions. And I would like to point out that while this is technically less than the 30 days, that is the maximum provided, we are quite confident that it provides the opportunity for council to consider any resolutions before the end of the year. At that meeting, if council does not pass any resolutions to amend the budget would be deemed adopted. Staff would request that council close the budget amendment process, and then the process would be complete for 2025 with the mayor's budget being adopted. If council did pass any resolutions to amend the budget, we move on to the next set of boxes. The mayor would then have the opportunity within 10 days to exercise his veto power on any of these amendments. If he opts not to exercise his veto, then the budget would be deemed adopted as amended by council. If the mayor does utilize his veto, then within 15 days of the end of the veto period, council may vote to override the mayor's veto, requiring a 2/3 majority vote to do so. If council does override the mayor's veto, then the budget would be adopted, including council's amendments. If council does not override the mayor's veto, then the budget would be deemed adopted without the amendments vetoed by the mayor. So I should be clear about one thing on this chart. It is overly simplistic. In a situation where council proposes numerous amendments and the mayor accepts some while vetoing others, the amendments that everyone agrees on would be adopted regardless of how council override goes. And both our finance, legal, and clerks are all prepared should we need to go through any of those things. We'll tackle them at the appropriate time. All right, so that's the timelines and approvals. I think it's also important that we spend a little bit of time talking about the process of building the budget and the key principles that guide our approach. All right, so there's a number of them listed here. I'm going to say a couple words on each one for you. So the first one is related to council's strategic priorities. And as you well know, council sets those various strategic priorities to guide and shape the organization. And these have an impact on how, where, and when we spend funds. The budget book is structured on council's strategic plan, and you'll see more in the coming slides about that, as well as in the commissioner presentations. The next item up is the mayoral direction. Earlier this year, Mayor Burton directed staff on some key parameters in building the staff-prepared draft budget. And I have a separate slide on those that I'll touch on in a minute. Next is PB2 methodology, which is the methodology that the town uses, and that is performance-based, program-based budgeting. And what this means is that we focus on programs rather than departments, and we have an emphasis on the allocation of resources based on desired outcomes, and the measurement of program results against those desired outcomes. So in a couple of slides, you'll see how we match our programs with council's strategic priorities. The fourth bullet is service levels. We build our budget around maintaining services and service levels that are valued by our residents. From time to time, this necessitates changes to various programs which can have a budgetary impact. Sound financial position. The town's finances have been well managed, and as a result, the town is in a sound financial position. Our capital and stabilization reserves currently exceed the recommended levels from the Government Finance Officers Association, and the town's debt levels are within both the provincial and internal limits. As we evaluate capital budget considerations, it's important to consider the impact that these projects will have on reserve and debt levels and allow us to maintain our strong financial position. Included as a staff report for today's meeting is a comprehensive summary of the town's various reserves and reserve funds. As you'll see in that report, while our stabilization and capital reserve levels are currently strong, some of our equipment reserves are struggling, and the long-term forecast for our capital reserve is showing a notable decrease. I will touch on our reserves in more detail later. However, for this slide, the important thing to keep in mind is that building out the budget requires us to keep one eye on our current service levels and tax rates, and the other eye on the long-term financial sustainability of the organization to ensure that our choices and decisions consider both impacts. Infrastructure and asset management. Infrastructure is a critical element of the town and its ability to deliver services that residents need and rely upon. The town has over $4 billion worth of infrastructure under its control, and it's very important that we take good care of it. We have established a corporate asset management plan, and we are continuing to build our corporate asset management culture. Asset management and the corporate asset management team play a big role in helping to establish the budget. The team works closely with departments to evaluate capital and operating requests and needs, taking risk and whole life cycle costing into account. And finally, growth. As the town continues to grow, this has an impact on the town's budget. This impacts us on the capital side with new projects that need to be completed, and these are primarily funded by development charges. It also impacts us on the operating side, as we need to consider the operating impacts of these projects and ideally match that with growth on our assessment roll. And again, I'll speak more to this later on in the presentation. All right, so a few minutes ago I mentioned council's strategic priorities, and that is one of our key budget principles. And so as you can see here, these are the key areas of focus for council, arranged into 4 different groups or buckets, all connected with the town's vision to be a vibrant and livable community for all. As members of council, you're probably more aware of these 4 strategic priority areas than anyone else, but I do think it's good to list them out here for everybody. And they are growth management, community belonging, environmental sustainability, and accountable government. As I move to the next slide, you'll see how we've grouped each of our programs under one of these areas to help connect our budget with the council's strategic priorities. So this graph here, and it's also on page 7 of the budget book, you can see that the priority areas from the previous slide are matched with the town's programs underneath. Finance has worked with our strategic group to arrange our budget book so that it is organized in a similar manner to these key focus areas. I also want to point out that the growth management category that's listed here is not the same as the capital growth projects that you'll see later in this presentation. This category refers to how we manage growth across the town, whereas the growth projects later on refer to those specific projects driven by growth within the town. I just want to stress that difference now as that comes up later on as well. And I'll come back to a similar slide to this in a little bit as we talk about how the budget spending is grouped by key priority area. All right, mayoral direction. This was another one of our key budget drivers that we need to consider as staff as we build out the budget. So earlier this year, the mayor provided direction to guide in building the staff-prepared draft budget. There were 5 key parts to the directive as it relates to the 2025 budget, and I've displayed a slightly smaller version of them here on screen for you. The first direction was that we continue to use PB2 budgeting and arrive at an overall increase of up to 4% while incorporating council's strategic plan priorities. The second was a directive to OPL for their budget submission. As a separate legal entity, the budget process is a little unique for the library, and providing them a specific direction makes it a bit easier for their board and senior management team to have a target to aim for as they look at their budget. The target this year was a bit higher than the town overall, as it did take into account the expected growth and assessment the town was expecting. Thirdly, the mayor directed staff to take a long-term view for financial sustainability and the use of the capital levy. The focus on ensuring long-term financial sustainability is aligned with council's strategic priorities that was touched on a few slides ago. The capital levy refers to one of the key funding sources that we have within our budget structure here at the town, and again, I'll touch on that more a little bit later. The fourth directive was to ensure that our services remain as they are and that our fee recoveries are in line with our fee policy. And finally, the last directive for the 2025 budget process speaks to the importance of engaging with the public throughout the process. One final variable that we do need to consider here at the town is that we are a lower tier municipality. The town share of the overall tax levy budget is about 43%, with the region of Halton and the province making up the remainder. This means that any changes that they may have will have an impact on the overall tax levy increase, and we do need to factor this in. All right, now that we've talked about the budget process, I'd like to spend some time talking about the operating budget itself. And to do that, I'm actually going to start with a bit of an overall view of this year's budget. So the $639 million that you see listed on the slide in front of you is the full amount of the investment and services that we are proposing to make next year in the town of Oakville. And this is for ongoing services and for capital projects. The operating budget is for $437 million, and the capital budget is for $202 million. Finally, the net tax levy is just shy of $279 million. And as you move to the next slide, you'll see how this is broken down into the strategic priorities set by council. So a few slides ago, we looked at the key areas of focus for council. And on this slide, you'll see the same headings that go across the top: growth management, community belonging, environmental sustainability, and accountable government. The numbers under each key area reflect the planned investments that the town is making in that category in this year's budget. And we do that for the operating investments in the first row, the capital investments in the second row, and then we show the total investment by category as well as the tax levy impact in the bottom 2 rows. And you'll notice that the tax levy impact is a much smaller amount than the gross amount, as the gross amount includes items funded from other sources such as user fees, reserves, grants, etc. In the commissioner presentations that follow my presentation and that are later this week, you'll hear much more about the many programs and initiatives under each of these key focus areas. However, I would like to take a moment to highlight a couple of key capital budget items in each area just to give you a flavor of it. So our investments in growth management include funds for 2 major fire projects, including the renovation and expansion of Fire Station Number 4 on 6th Line, and land for future construction of a new fire station in North Oakville. Community belonging includes funds for the purchase of replacement buses, funds for replacing Rink A at River Oaks, and funds for traffic calming and road safety. Under the environmental sustainability key focus area, are investments for parkland acquisition and funds for parks, trails, and park facilities, as well as funds for transit electric charging infrastructure and funds for the rehabilitation of Town Square. Accountable government. Many of these investments are for the behind-the-scenes work that happens here at the town, including IT and some related facility costs. Now, before I leave this slide, I do want to give a couple of reminders to council. So one, this chart, at least the operating portion, will not match the totals from the previous slide, as we've removed the corporate items as they don't naturally fit into one of these categories, and I do have a separate slide on the corporate revenues and expenses coming up. The second item is that some of the projects can fit into more than one category, but for simplicity in here and in the budget book, they've only been included in one category. And finally, we do have a similar chart that is found in the executive summary of our budget book, and that's on page 8, if you want to take a look at it there. And that pages after that also break out some more of the key initiatives in each focus area. I just picked a couple from there, but there's a lot more listed in the budget book. All right, so now I'd like to spend some time talking about the tax levy impacts for this year's proposed budget. I'm going to start with a high-level summary of the impacts for our residents and taxpayers, and then move into some more of the details on the specific drivers for this year's budget. The total tax levy, as proposed in the budget, is $278.8 million, and this represents a $19.5 million increase overall, and a $15 million increase after adjusting for growth as compared to the figures from last year's budget. On a percentage increase for existing residents, the town share is just under a 6% increase, and as part of the entire tax bill after adding in the region and education shares, this works out to a 3.92% increase, in line with the council-endorsed mayoral direction. These figures may change based upon decisions by the mayor and council, as well as any changes that we receive on the growth figures from MPAC. So before I leave this slide, I want to point out one more thing. When you review the budget book, you'll notice that we've added some of this key information to the first page in our budget book. That's something new for this year. And we've made this change to make it easier for residents to see the key information right away, as we want to make it as simple and transparent as possible for people. All right, so that brings us to our budget drivers slide. And so this chart can be found in the budget overview section of the budget book on page 14. And I know it does have a lot of information on it. However, it does capture what the key drivers are for the changes in this year's operating budget. So I'll walk you through each of these factors and do my best to explain how each driver impacts the town's 2025 operating budget. So before I do that, I just want to touch on the columns that go across the top of this chart. So the first column is the budget drivers, the things that impact the budget. The second column down at the bottom shows the town's share of the budget along with that of the region and for education. The third column has the increase in actual dollars in millions, while the fourth column has the percentage change on the town's tax levy, followed by the percentage change on the tax bill itself. And the last column is what the impact means for $100,000 worth of assessment, and we do this so that residents can see what the impact of the budget is to their own property. So now I'll go through each budget driver and talk about each one a little bit. So first up, we have inflationary impacts. This line reflects changes to the existing base that provides for the same level of service as in the previous year. The largest driver is for personnel increases for our labor costs. And in addition, here's where we have the impact for the rising costs of materials, supplies, and services for our operations. This line also includes increases to the equipment reserve transfers to ensure that we are setting aside funds for the cost of vehicles and equipment and the impact that this has on our reserves. Finally, changes in revenue from increasing our user fees in line with our user fee policy is also included in this row. And one thing I would like to point out here is that the $8.75 million that you see on this row is higher than the figure that we provided to you as Budget Committee back in June. That preliminary figure was about $5.5 million, and as we went through the budget process, additional impacts were identified, including increases to our purchase services, as well as increases for personnel costs related to WSIB, and increases for reserve transfers. All right, growth and capital is next. So this category captures the additions to the operating budget of new growth and new capital projects. Each year as we go through the budget process, we also identify any increased costs related to growth or to bring new capital projects into our operations. This is a routine driver that we have, though the amount depends on the nature of the projects and growth. Of the $5.6 million in increases to the 2025 budget, almost all of them are related to the operating impacts of capital projects. For 2025, the operating impacts of opening 16 Mile Community Center and Park is the largest single driver at approximately $2 million, and that is net of expected revenues. After this, there are also costs for ITS projects and for transit related to the operating costs for the new charging infrastructure. And these increases also come with 28 additional FTEs, and the commissioners will touch more on these in their presentations. I would like to point out that the amount of capital in this line has decreased from our earlier expectations, as the addition of transit buses has been pushed out to 2026. And so as a result, we've also pushed out the assessment growth, or the deferred assessment growth driver, to 2026 as well, and this will come up later in my presentation. All right, now we'll talk about items that have been added to the budget to address council's strategic priorities. So to help describe this in more detail, I have 4 charts that break out these $1.16 million in additions, one for each quadrant of the strategic plan. The items that you're going to see on these slides are not specific action items from the strategic plan. However, they do relate to the specific priority areas identified by council and will enable the town to address these key topics for the long term. So first, we have items related to growth management, which has a $1.2 million worth of total investment for a net tax levy increase of $380,000. And before I jump into this slide and the next 3, I do want to point out a couple of items. Each slide is just a summary of what has been added. More information will come in the commissioner presentations and is in the budget book itself. So if you have a specific question on one of the items that are listed here, you'll certainly have an opportunity after the commissioner presentations to ask that. Secondly, these are not in any prioritized order. These are simply by program, alphabetized by program. So there's no prioritization to the list. And the third thing I want to point out is that for many of the FTE positions, the planned start date is not January 1st. So the figure included in the budget reflects the expected start date. Any remaining impact to annualize this position would be included in the 2026 budget. And then finally, we've included both the total investment column and the tax levy impact column, as some items are funded by the tax levy, while others are partially or entirely funded by fees, recoveries from capital, or stabilization funding. The total line also includes the percent impact that these additions contributed to the overall tax levy. So specifically on this slide, I just wanted to highlight the updated investment in automated speed enforcement, and I know Commissioner Fu will touch on that in her presentation. Next, we have community belonging, which has $571,000 in total investment for a net tax levy impact of $372,000. And the largest inclusion here is the addition of more firefighters, something identified in our fire master plan, and something that Commissioner DeMassa will touch on in his presentation. Third, we have environmental sustainability, which has almost $500,000 in total investment for a net tax levy impact in 2025 of $71,000. And temporary funding for the winter recreation strategy is included here, and again, Commissioner DeMassa will speak more to this in his presentation. And finally, accountable government, which has $339,000 in both total investment and, as it's fully funded by the tax levy, that's the tax levy amount as well. So a good deal of this work is done behind the scenes, but I will highlight the security awareness training, as IT security is very much a hot topic these days, and Commissioner Sully will be touching on that in her presentation. All right, back to our budget driver chart. So the next line is for the annualization of items approved in prior years. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, when we add some items to the budget, whether they be positions or service contracts, they don't often start on January 1st. And so as a result, we only include the portion we need for that year's budget. And then we pick up the remaining impact in the next year to ensure that we've annualized the item. And so these are the items from last year's budget that were added, that we're bringing in, or finishing bringing in to this year's budget. So our next line is actually a new line for this year. As part of the mayor's direction last year and this year, he has provided a specific target to OPL to assist them in planning for their budget. As a separate legal entity, giving them an overall target like this allows them to balance their various needs and pressures within one envelope. For 2025, the target for OPL was 5.5%, which was inclusive of any growth impacts that they may experience, sorry. So the $0.67 million that you see here, or 670,000, represents the amount of the 5.5% envelope to their operating budget that's been added for this year. I know there's other percentages following it. That's in reference to the towns. The 0.67 represents the 5.5% for their budget. And finally, in this section, the capital levy. The town has a long-standing practice of taking 1% of the prior year's total tax levy and adding that to our capital envelope. And this is a very valuable tool that allows us to finance the various capital projects that the town undertakes. This funding source becomes even more important as we continue our asset management plan and look to our future infrastructure needs. All right, now we're going to move to the two rows highlighted in yellow, and these are the last two COVID impacts that we still have in our operating budget. So just as a refresher, coming out of the pandemic, ridership and transit had not yet recovered to pre-pandemic levels. So as a result, we had been estimating the expected loss in ridership each year, and then funding that lost revenue from our tax stabilization reserve so that we didn't burden Oakville residents with a temporary blip in lost transit fee revenues. So in 2024's budget, the estimate of lost revenue was down to 1.2 million. And as you heard from Adrian last night, ridership and transit has rebounded. And I'm happy to say that we can finally remove this impact and the corresponding funding from the tax stabilization reserve. And so this should be the last time that you have to see the rows in this chart, or I have to try to explain it. All right. So that brings us to our total operating budget impact before growth of $19.5 million, or 7.52%. Now that number is reduced, however, by the assessment growth that we have added for this year. So assessment growth reflects the additional properties that are being added to the tax roll that were not included in the prior year's budget. This is a regular budget driver, though the amount of growth does fluctuate, and this year's assessment growth is just over $4 million. I also want to add that I'm hopeful that between now and budget deliberations that we'll have an updated figure from MPAC for you. And this may provide some extra room in either this year's budget or room that could be saved for next year's budget, as we do have budget pressures in 2026 that I'll speak to in a few minutes. Okay, so that's the end of our budget drivers. As it stands now, before any other adjustments, the town's overall tax increase to existing residents is $15.42 million, or 5.95% of the town's tax levy. And then when you add in the regional and education components, this brings the total increase to 3.92%, which works out to $31.19 per $100,000 of assessment. And so we usually show this in a couple of different ways as well, just to help visualize what it means. So we have this pyramid chart that is on page 13 of the budget book, and it shows the program increase at the bottom of 7.52%, and that's before assessment growth. After we add in the assessment growth, you'll see that the town's increase to existing residents is 5.95%. And then once you layer in the region education shares, the overall increase comes in at 3.92%. Another way to visualize this is on $100 worth of taxes, what that would get you. And that's grouped by major program area. And this chart actually comes from page 11 of the budget book. And as you can see, infrastructure renewal, representing the corporate budget transfers to reserves, has the largest share at almost $23, followed by emergency services, transit, and the road network. And these amounts are very consistent with the same chart that I showed you last year. All right, before we leave the 2025 operating budget, there are three more topics that I would like to touch on briefly, as I know they're important to Mayor and Council. The first of these is in regards to efficiencies. As staff, we keep an eye out for ways to make our processes and departments more efficient. In the past, we've done a number of reviews and initiatives to look for costs that can be saved from the operating budget. These low-hanging fruit type items have already been identified and incorporated. What we see more now is the focus on continuous improvement as we refine processes throughout the organization, and these tend to be non-financial efficiencies, and the focus on cost mitigation. So cost mitigation or cost avoidance is especially key as a growing municipality. As we add more assets and deliver more services, it is imperative that we identify ways that we can do this efficiently so we can maintain our existing service levels without adding costs to existing taxpayers. This approach also applies every time that there are legislative environment changes that we have to deal with. The other two topics that I'd like to touch on are corporate revenues and expenses and inflation trends, and I've got a couple of slides on each of those. So the first of those two is the corporate revenues and expenses, and I'm not going to go through each row in this chart. The information on here does come from the budget book, the corporate section of the budget book, on page 312. However, I do want to point out a couple of key things. So on the first row under personnel, we have made a couple of key adjustments here. As any employer, we experience what is called gapping, when a staff member leaves a position and we need to find a replacement. The time from the staff member leaving to when we find a successor results in savings as we are not paying any salary during that time. Each year in the budget, we include a provision for this gapping, as we know that it will happen throughout the year and throughout the organization. This year, we have increased our gapping budget by $1 million up to $2.8 million. We've worked with our team in HR to ensure that this figure is reasonable given our past experience, what other employers experience, and taking into account other factors such as overtime. We have made one other change for gapping this year as well. We've taken a portion of the gapping that is included here in the corporate section and moved it out to each of the departments. And we've done this to better match our program expenses, keeping in line with PB2 methodology, and to avoid the appearance of savings in programs over here, while we have budgeted savings over here in corporate. So we're trying to tell that story a little bit more cleanly. Moving on to purchase services, this includes the cost for our WSIB amounts, which we've had to increase by $1 million. And this is due to recent trends in our WSIB experience. I do want to state that this is not because we are an unsafe employer. Rather, this is specifically related to the legislation for presumptive claims for emergency services. As part of the adjustments we've made this year, we have also updated the recovery calculation that the emergency services program is charged for WSIB, and you'll see that in the corporate revenue slide in a minute, as well as in their program budget. On the payments and grants line, much of this number is for debt charges. In fact, almost 13 million of that 14 million is for debt charges. So similar to the interest earnings that I'll touch on in a minute, all of our debt charges are recorded through our corporate revenues and expenses. So this means that the debt charges here are listed as an expense. However, any non-tax funding for this debt, think of DC payments for, or DC charges for debt, they will come through on the revenues, and I'll touch on that in the next slide. This number has increased from last year by almost $5 million, due primarily to the 16-mile debt, though there is a corresponding recovery from DCs in the revenue section. And then finally, on the internal expenses and transfers, this is the line that we use for our transfers to reserves. So we've got $46 million for our capital levy, $14 million for our capital reserve, $11 million for our hydro dividend, and $20 million for interest earnings, plus a number of other ones. You can see there's a number of big transfers in there. So switching to the corporate revenues for a moment, I'm not going to touch on each item, but I will point out a few key components. The first row up there is supplementary taxes, and we have increased this figure significantly by $1.7 million to reflect the trends that we're seeing as a growing municipality. For the same reason, we've increased the penalties and interest on taxes, the budget for that as well, and that's in the fourth row on this chart. Interest income is the next item to talk about. So last year I had mentioned that the amount had increased significantly, and now I'm here to say that the figure has gone down significantly due to the fluctuations in interest rates. While that means that our reserves will likely earn less interest in the coming year, as most of our earnings go there, the good news for the overall tax levy is that there is no changes based on the rates and balances. We are comfortable with what we have currently budgeted. One item that has increased is the hydro dividend. Based on the most recent projections from OEC, they are expecting to return a dividend to the town of $12 million, up from the $6.1 million that we currently receive. While these funds don't reduce the tax levy, we do put them in a reserve that we will use to fund the debt payments for the downtown library. Fund transfers, which is the line below that, that refers to any funds that we have taken from our reserves for specific purposes. If you think back to my comment a moment ago on the DC debt payments, this is where we see the funds coming in for the DC reserve funds that will pay those DC debt charges. And finally, internal recoveries are one of the mechanisms that we use here for our internal accounting. The big change in this balance for 2025 is the increased funds that we pull from our program budgets for the WSIB costs that I mentioned a moment ago. Most of that is coming from the emergency services budget, and when you review the budget book, you also see that highlighted in their program. So once you net all of our revenues and expenses, you'll see that the net impact on the tax levy is a cost of just over $34 million. Considering that our capital levy alone is getting close to $50 million, this means that the various corporate revenue sources are offsetting the expenses and making a dent in the capital levy requirement for our taxpayers. All right, inflation. I also realized before I get into this chart, it's probably going to be out of date. I think the Bank of Canada comes out with a new projections tomorrow. So this will be quickly out of date, but we can update it for you. So this is a slide that we've actually presented to you before in our forecast presentation. And so I'll walk you through it in a little bit more detail. So you can see our tax increases, which are the blue line. They have historically stayed quite close to inflation, and inflation is the dotted black line. And there tends to be a bit of a lag at times, as you can see that in the past couple of years, we've been far below inflation and are now playing a bit of catch-up. Inflation from 2022 to 2024, as seen in that dashed black line, has trended almost to 4 1/3% as it's gone on a roller coaster ride, while our 3-year trend on tax increases has been below this at 3 1/3. I do hope that inflation continues to trend down, as that should hopefully help with some of the pressures we see in our contracts and construction projects. Having said that, inflation going up and then down creates a difficult environment in which to budget, especially as the impacts of inflation work their way through the economy. You'll see that in a minute when we look ahead to 2026 and some of the challenges that we'll face. All right, so we're going to switch now from the operating budget to a couple of slides on the operating forecast. So I know that we're only considering the 2025 budget for approval for this year, but it is important to look ahead to the future. And so this chart, which can be found on page 24 of the budget book, is similar to our current year budget driver chart, but has a few differences. Across the top, the chart shows the forecasted impact on the town's tax levy and the tax bill itself, and we do this for both 2026 and 2027. As you can see, there will be some significant pressures in next year's budget, as the estimated tax increases are just over 4% for 26 and just under 3.5% for 27. These are largely driven by some significant operating impacts of capital and growth. The largest driver here is the addition of transit buses, both expansion and replacement buses. These projects bring additional operating pressures for new bus drivers and higher reserve transfers for their eventual replacement. As these were pushed into 2026, we have also pushed the deferred assessment growth into 2026, which you can see in the 6th row. This figure is listed as a negative as it actually helps to reduce the overall impact. I also want to highlight the 3rd row down, Council's strategic priorities. There are a number of initiatives and positions that were identified during the current year's budget process that they do contribute to Council's strategic plan, but they could not be accommodated in 2025. So we've included them here for 2026 and for 2027, and as I go to the next slide, you'll see this in more detail. So these are the list of items that were not included in the 2025 budget, but have been included in the forecast for 2026. And I know that this is hard to read, but we will be providing this list to Budget Committee closer to deliberations as per the request that was made at the June budget meeting. So you have plenty of time to take a deeper look into it if you like. And just to be clear on that request from the June budget meeting, we'll have a spreadsheet listing all the items from 2025 as well as the items that are listed here for 26 and their impact on the tax levy, so Council can understand the impact of adding or deferring the various items. And then one other thing I'd like to point out on this list is that the same cautions I mentioned when I went through those 4 charts for the 2025 editions apply here as well, including the fact that they are grouped by council strategic priority. They are not in any prioritized order. And then I also have another slide. These are items that, while they are important, were not prioritized as highly and have not been included in the 2026 forecast, though they were identified by staff through this year's budget process. And they too will be included on that spreadsheet that I was referring to a moment ago. All right, that concludes the things I'd like to say about the operating budget. Now we're going to switch gears to the capital budget. So the 2025 capital budget has a number of key initiatives and projects that total to $202.1 million. As you can see, that figure is broken down here into the 3 categories that we use to organize the town's capital budget. I'll go through each of these captions here and touch on a couple of the key items. However, more details are available in the budget book and will be touched on by the commissioners in their presentations. So for growth of $92 million, that includes $12 million for the fire station number 4 renovation and expansion, $8.7 million for the future fire station number 10, $2 million for PXOs, $9 million for various roadworks, $6 million for conventional expansion buses, and $37 million for parkland acquisition. Infrastructure renewal of $87 million includes $2.8 million for the 16-mile West Harbor renewal, a variety of various equipment and vehicle replacements, $5.7 million for Rink A at River Oaks, $6 million for the road resurfacing program, and $14 million for conventional replacement buses. Oh, sorry, I went too fast here. The last category on here is for program initiatives, which is for the strategic priorities that are not related to growth or infrastructure renewal. This year's budget has $22.5 million in projects, including $4.3 million for the town square rehabilitation, $4 million for the lease related to the transit electric charging infrastructure, and $2.6 million for the traffic calming program. And again, those are just some of the highlights that are included in these categories. We also have this chart on the capital budget by program. I won't go into too much detail here, as the commissioners will touch on some of the more significant objectives in their presentations, but I think it provides a clear representation as to which program areas have the bulk of our capital spending. And then while that previous slide focused on the spending side of things, this slide focuses on where we will get the funds to pay for those capital projects. So as you can see, the capital levy and our capital reserves are our largest funding source for this year's capital budget. And given that infrastructure renewal and program initiatives are total to over $110 million, that's to be expected. Development charges, the CBC, and Parkland are also significant funding sources for us. And please keep in mind that the amount of growth funding fluctuates each year depending on the nature and timing of the projects that we have in each year's budget. All right. This year's budget also includes our 10-year capital forecast, which lists our projects all the way out to 2034. And so similar to the budget, to the capital budget chart, I'll touch on a couple of the key highlights as part of the $2.1 billion in our capital forecast. So growth of $960 million includes funds for new parks and parkland acquisitions, future fire stations, work at the North Ops Depot, new buses, and over $400 million for various road and active transportation projects. Infrastructure renewal of just over $1 billion includes money for vehicle and equipment replacements, the new Central Library branch, road resurfacing, various facilities, park renewals, roads, bridges, storm sewers, buses, and IT projects. And then program initiatives of $117 million includes funds for work on invasive species, traffic calming, Kelsa Gate urbanization, and the capital lease for bus electrification equipment. I should also point out that the program initiatives figure on screen here does not currently include the high-level cost estimates for work relating to the Centennial Square site of the Downtown Cultural Hub, including a future theater. These costs are estimated at $221 million. And as these funds are not yet funded, we have listed them as an additional item in the capital detail summary, but the costs are not included in the supporting charts and graphs in the 10-year capital forecast. And Commissioner DeMasso will have more information on the DCH in his presentation. All right, so this is the same type of slide that I had up for the current year capital budget, except now the figures are for the 10-year forecast. And I've also included some colors to represent the different types of projects. So you'll see growth in the light blue, infrastructure renewal in the dark blue, and program initiatives in the green. And we've done this to show which program areas have a heavy growth focus versus infrastructure renewal. As we continue to refine our asset management plan, our financial strategies for these infrastructure items will become more robust. And this slide also highlights for us the significant amount of capital work that is upcoming for the town, as it's over $2 billion. And it also leads us into a conversation about how we pay for our capital budget, namely with growth funding tools and town reserves, specifically the capital reserve, and I've got a couple of slides on each of these items. So the first item up is growth funding tools. So the reserve report that is on today's agenda does an excellent job of describing the three primary tools: development charges, community benefits charge, or the CBC, and parkland dedication. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on them in today's presentation, but I do want to focus on a couple of things. So we have this combination chart here that shows both our forecasted DC spending and our projected balances. So I'll walk you through the different components here. The dark blue bars represent the expected spending in each year of the 10-year forecast, with the small green cap on each representing the debt financing for that year. The big gray bar in 2025 represents the projects that Council has already approved that is currently unspent but is committed to the projects. The light blue background shows the projected balance for each year. And I should point out that while the total remains positive, some of our individual reserves do go negative throughout the forecast. So over the 10-year forecast period, the DC forecasted balance is growing due to a shift of major transportation projects beyond the forecast period. Collections for capital projects can result in the buildup of DC reserve funds. However, there are some significant projects outside the forecast that will result in a decline in DC reserve funds. Should also say that the town's program areas are undertaking service area master plans, which will identify the land and infrastructure needed to maintain service levels as the town grows. These master plans will incorporate updated growth forecasts and the associated capital projects required in the coming years. As a result, the 2025 capital forecast is primarily based on the previous master plans and growth expectations to 2031. These figures will be updated to account for new land and infrastructure requirements, along with current growth forecasts over the longer term during the 2026 budget. And this will also lead us into a new DC background study to ensure that collections are sufficient to fund the long-term forecast. So that previous slide showed that our DC balances, at least as a whole, remain positive over the 10-year forecast. However, there does remain uncertainty and significant risk to DC revenue due to Bill 23. I have on screen here the chart that we provide to Council each month to highlight the lost revenue from these changes. I won't go through each column, as I know you're quite familiar with it, but there are a couple of things I wanted to highlight. First, while the phase-in reduction has now been eliminated, which is a good thing, beginning in June, exemptions for affordable residential units came into force. While there have been no exemptions provided to date, the magnitude of these exemptions may be significant and, depending on how the province plans to keep municipalities whole, could result in significant impact to DC collections used to pay for growth-related projects. I should also point out that there still is one outstanding regulation for the prescription of land for certain services as an ineligible cost, which would shift those costs away from the DCs and again onto other sources such as the capital reserve. And we'll continue to keep Council updated on this chart each month. In fact, I don't even think you've seen this one yet. This is a sneak preview of the one that'll be in the next CAO update. All right, so the other key funding source that we have are reserves and reserve funds. And so I've listed the major categories on the chart here, showing both the 2024 projected balances in the lighter blue and the 2025 projected balances in the darker blue. I won't spend too much time on this slide, as the reserve report on today's agenda provides a lot more details about these reserve categories. While most of our reserves are quite healthy in the short term, I would like to point out a couple of things. First, the capital reserve does trend negative throughout the 10-year forecast, and I have a few more slides on that in just a minute. Secondly, the program-specific reserves are currently negative, primarily due to harbors. A harbors master plan is planned for 2025, which will be followed by a business plan. And the business plan will provide an opportunity to explore partnerships to address some of the financial pressures with the harbors program. and clarity on the future of Bronte Outer Harbor operations will be needed to assist with a long-term strategy for harbors. And then finally, equipment reserves are forecasted to be negative by the end of 2025. As part of the budget process and in conjunction with the departments and asset management, a detailed review of the vehicles scheduled for replacement takes place each year, and needs are prioritized based on the condition of the assets. The transit and fire equipment reserves will go negative in 2025, but they do return to positive over the short term. Increases to transfers to reserves have been included in the budget to ensure that they return to sufficient levels. When reserves are negative, in accordance with our reserve and reserve fund policy, they are charged interest based on the town's investment rate of return, so internal borrowing between reserves takes place. So now on to our capital reserve. The capital reserve is one of the town's largest funding sources for our program initiatives and much of our infrastructure renewal needs. The reserve is increased each year with reserve transfers and our capital levy, and is often supported by proceeds from land sales. Currently, the capital reserve balance is in a strong position with a 2025 ending balance projected at $104 million. However, over the next 10 years, the balance is projected to decrease steadily, and if this is not mitigated, it is projected to head into a negative position with a low of negative $89 million in 2031. We do not actually plan on allowing this reserve to become negative, and lots can change over the course of a 10-year forecast, but this speaks to the fact that decisions will need to be made to address this. The reserve report that we've included on today's agenda contains more commentary on this, but there are a number of items leading us to that position, including the ones listed on this slide. So asset management. Asset management plays a key role in our capital planning. We are well along on our asset management journey and continue to work towards meeting all of the provincial regulations, which includes the need for a financing plan for all of our assets in the asset management plan. As we continue to do this work, we identify more projects that need to be added to our forecast. And while that does have the impact of adding to the forecasted needs, it is helpful to highlight for us what critical work will need to be done in the short term and the long term, so we as an organization can make the right decisions, the best decisions possible as to how to most effectively use our resources and to consider the service levels that we should be operating at. Tied very closely into this is our need to address our stormwater-related infrastructure. As seen in the stormwater management workshop and reports that have been brought to council, there are a lot of needs in this area that the town will need to address. Environmental sustainability. The town has invested and continues to plan to invest in some significant areas to address climate change, including our transit electrification. These investments are more expensive and require funding. And finally, inflation. As you've seen in our quarterly reports, the costs for all types of construction have risen rapidly, and this is putting pressure on our reserves. As a side note, this is a key reason why the extra investment income that we've earned the past couple of years has been transferred to the capital reserve. As interest rates have increased to rein in inflation, we've taken that increased investment earnings and that we've earned as a result and placed them into our capital reserve to try to mitigate some of the inflation impacts that we're seeing. And I do have one graph that helps to highlight this. And this is the same chart that is on page 10 of the reserve report that is in today's agenda package. And this chart shows the forecasted balance in our capital reserve over the 10-year forecast. So the light blue line is what I showed you last year, whereas the dark blue line is the updated figure for 2025. The dotted green line represents the targeted balance in a capital reserve based on the GFOA recommendations, which is equivalent to 1 year's worth of the average capital requirements. And as you can see in the chart, the capital reserve forecast has improved in comparison to the 2024 forecast, despite a lower starting point. This is in part due to adjustments to the timing of some major capital projects and reductions in scope, along with leveraging revenue sources. So to further describe that, one of the major changes to the budget that helped offset these pressures was the council-approved revision to the scope of the Lakeshore Road West Road project. And that indefinitely deferred the section east of Bronte Athletic Park to Dorval Drive, resulting in savings of $40 million to the capital reserve. Another reason for the improvement to the capital reserve outlook is the utilization of additional dividend income from OEC that I mentioned earlier. And while these changes have highlighted some improvements to the reserve, there were significant increases to the budget for asset management needs, including the renewal of parks, stormwater infrastructure, and bridges and culverts, including the future replacement of the Royal Windsor Drive Bridge at the end of the forecast. As the balance trends down over time, the capital program as presented will require additional funding over the forecast period through increases to the capital levy and/or new revenue sources. And so, just to segue from that, I know that's a bit of a somber story, but I do want to assure you that this is our 10-year forecast, and our reserves are currently healthy. So we do have time to address these concerns, and this slide lists a few of the options that are available to us. So the first is other sources of revenues. So this could include support from other levels of government in the way of grant funding, like we are currently pursuing for our transit electrification, or there is the consideration of a stormwater fee, or the use of dividends from OEC or MDC. Another option is taxation. The capital levy is a very valuable source of funding for the town, and I would encourage council to continue to add the 1% levy in each year's budget. Deferral or removal of certain projects. The first two options are on the revenue side of the ledger, and this is on the expense side of the ledger. Deferring costs to future years or reducing them either on the number of projects or on a project scope are ways that can address these concerns. And these are things that I would encourage council to keep in the back of your mind as you review the budget and consider decisions in the upcoming years. So one more thing that I'd like to touch on as it relates to the capital reserve, or really to our discretionary reserves in general, is the impact that projected balances have on our debt to reserve ratio. And so our debt to reserve ratio is just that. It's a reflection of how much debt we have relative to our reserves. Our policy is to keep this relationship below 1-to-1 to help the region of Halton maintain their very high credit rating. In 2024, the ratio did exceed the 1-to-1 ratio for a part of the 10-year forecast, but with the positive changes to the capital reserve, the ratio now stays below this target, which is a positive indicator of the financial sustainability of the town. This is something that we will need to keep an eye on as we consider our reserve and debt levels and make choices accordingly about projects and spending. And speaking of debt, I also have a slide on debt. Debt is also a funding tool that we can use here at the town. While all municipalities have limits on their debt levels set by the province, the town has further limits on our debt capacity. And we have that for tax-supported debt, total corporate debt, and DC debt. And we've established these limits to ensure that our debt levels remain appropriate and don't overburden us. So this chart is a little bit busy, but I will walk you through the details in it. The bars at each year are the town's various types of debt. We have tax-supported debt in dark blue, OEC-supported debt for the hospital and library in light blue, self-supported debt in purple. For example, that's debt issued for something like the harbors. And then we have debt for development activities, which is paid for by DC revenues, and that's in gray. Again, think of the 16-mile debt that I mentioned earlier. The green line at the top is the town's total debt limit, which is 12% of our own source revenue. And as you can see, we are way below this limit for the entire 10-year forecast. The red line is the town's tax-supported debt limit, basically removing the self-supported and DC components of debt. So as you can see, the blue portions of the bar also remain below the red line, so for the entire 10-year forecast, so we are within that limit as well. All right, last but not least, we have rates and fees. So each year as part of the annual budget process, rates and fees are reviewed by departments to ensure they reflect the cost of delivering services. And this is in keeping with our rates and fees policy. As a reminder, whenever fees do not fully cover the cost of the program, that impact does fall to the tax levy. The direction issued by the mayor was that staff look to keep our fees in line with our user fee policy to ensure that the cost recovery rates are appropriate. Included in today's agenda is a staff report which includes more information about the rates and fees and has an appendix outlining all of the specific rates and fees to be considered for approval. The fees are posted on the town's website to allow the public time to review them. And the staff prepared draft budget includes the revenues associated with the proposed fees. Now, as rates and fees are approved by council and are not part of the strong mayor legislation, they, along with the attached planning bylaw, will need to be approved by council at the conclusion of the budget process. So therefore, at the right time, we'll provide wording for a motion to approve the rates and fees for 2025 in December. So that brings us to the end of today's overview presentation. There are a couple of key takeaways here for members of the Budget Committee. First, the 2025 operating budget as presented by staff is coming in at 3.92%, which is under the 4% as per the Mayor's direction, and that was endorsed by Council. The overall budget, both capital and operating, contains key investments and programs to deliver services to residents and to address Council's strategic plan. There are some significant operating pressures coming in the next 2 years with forecasted tax increases of over 3%. The current capital budget is fully funded thanks to the current strong position in our reserves. And lastly, while the long-term capital reserve forecast has improved from last year, decisions will need to be made as we look at the 10-year forecast to ensure that we continue to maintain our strong financial position. So with that, I would also like to just remind everybody that the budget books are available for you. Like I said earlier, I think most of you have them already. The digital version of the budget book is already online for the public to see as well, including our capital detail sheet and our capital forecast map. And as I wrap up my remarks, I did want to say thanks to those that have played a role in getting us to where we are today. Our department staff do a lot of work in preparing their budgets and their business cases. They're trying to balance the increases that they see, especially on inflation, with the desire to keep taxes low. And they do a good job of trying to balance those two things. I also want to say thank you to ELT. There's a lot of extra budget meetings that they have to work through with us, and so we've appreciated their help and guidance as we've gone through it. And then finally, to my own team, Matt and Dalabar and their teams are fantastic. They do all of the work that goes into the details that you see in front of you today, so I do want to thank them for all of their commitment to this year's budget. And Chair Grant, I will turn it back to you now.
Thank you. Over an hour of speaking and not a waver in your voice. Very good. We do have questions from Mayor Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have one request, which is could we have a brief bio break? And when we come back, I would like to go back to slide 49 and talk about and get some additional clarification from Jonathan. That slide talks about the DC Reserve background, and that is the most misinterpreted information in the constant argument we have with the government and the development community over development charges, where it makes it look like we've got money we're not using. So we need to go into how that actually is a constant flow in and out, and hope that they hear us when they go to misquote us. And so those are my requests. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think Jonathan would appreciate the little time to rest his voice, so we'll take 10 minutes.
Sorry, Chair Grant, just before, would it be possible during that break that we could get a copy of your presentation? Is it in the budget book in the front?
It's in the agenda.
Okay, sorry, thank you.
All right, 10 minutes. See you then. Sorry?
It's online.
All right, we shall continue. And I believe where we left off, the mayor was going to ask a few questions and make a few comments with Jonathan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Van der Heijden, thank you very much for the presentation. I believe that's actually the most comprehensible, easiest to understand presentation that I've heard in 18 years. So thank you for that. If you would dial us back to, I just want to ask some illuminating questions, I hope, on slides 49 and 52. Let's go to 49 if possible, please. Okay, so as I teased this before the break, what happens downtown at Queen's Park and out there in the constant battle that the builders organization wages against us in the public? They use this slide, or others just like it, to falsely suggest that we're sitting on a pile of money we're not using. And I've been hearing that for a good 5-6 years now from these folks. And so what we need is to spend a minute for Mr. Van der Heijden to explain how that blue background, every year, the money in there goes down as we spend it and up as we collect it. And there's a down up in every year as we spend and collect, spend and collect, spend and collect. And that is not a piggy bank that the Government of Ontario or the Builders Association can rob. But that is exactly what's been going on as the province has cut into our development charges and created exemptions and all. And Mr. Van der Heijden, could you validate what I said? Because I'm only a politician, and you know, it's far more credible when it comes from professional financial staff. So explain that a little more better, please.
Certainly, through you, Chair Grant. So there's a couple of things that you touched on there, Mayor Burton, that are indeed correct. So one is this light blue background you see is just the total balance. It does not show all of the revenues that we take in each year and the expenses that we have. We are currently building 16 Mile Community Center. There are a lot of DC generated funds that we are spending on that facility. So you don't see that in and that out. It is a constant churn. And as I touched on in my comments, sometimes those balances actually go negative. They go low as we spend the money and then as we collect it. And there's a timing difference on the spending and the collecting. And that's probably the second part to touch on, is that if you were to expand this chart, if you were to go back 10 years, those balances would actually at some points be lower, as we've had years where we have a lot more spending than we have collecting. And if you were to project, we don't have a chart that goes out beyond the 10-year, but there are a number of projects that are just outside the 10-year forecast, and then you'll see the balances drop. So there is very much there's fluctuations within the year, and then there's fluctuations within the long-term nature. And the importance when you look at DCs is that long-term planning. You can't just take a 3-year snapshot and say the balances were high in these years. It is looking at that long-term to say, what do we need to make sure that we're maintaining services across the entire organization or across the entire town?
Yeah, thank you for that.
And then if I can add one more thing.
Please.
The other thing too is we do update our DC bylaw regularly to make sure we're capturing all of the required items that go into our DC rates to make sure that it is up to date too. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that.
That's perfect. I mean, the bottom line is we are a dynamic, nimble, and circumstance adjusting $4 or $5 billion corporation delivering municipal services to our residents. And we have every reason to be proud of the way we do it, and especially the fiscal strength that we maintain. Could we also talk about slide 52, please? So I may actually have chosen the wrong slide. But what I want to get at is, it's the reference to stormwater here that keyed my interest. You have another chart showing the capital reserves declining over, thank you, this one, 53. So we are considering a stormwater fee, and I need a little clarification as to whether this 2025 projection is before or after us if we shift. So I guess you couldn't show us the impact of what would happen to that if we did adopt the stormwater fee instead of using taxes. Can you speak to that? What would happen to our capital reserve balances there in the dark blue if we did shift to the stormwater fee?
Certainly, through you, Chair Grant. So just to clarify first on this slide, so this slide shows the balance in our capital reserve forecast, which for a number of the stormwater projects that are in the forecast is a funding source. So they are included in here. But we did actually expect that this question would come up. So if I actually go to the end of my presentation, oops, apparently I went too far. Can I get some help to pull it back up for the very last slide? Maybe I'll go slower this time. There we go. Okay. So what we did is we also layered in what the capital reserve forecast would look like by removing, starting in 2027, all of the stormwater projects that were funded from the capital reserve. So if those projects came out of our capital reserve as a funding source and moved over to stormwater, this is what the balance would be projected at. That assumes a straight move and everything else stays the same. It's done very simply, but it would remain slightly positive. I forget that number. I want to say it was about $5 million, I think, by the end. But over the forecast, that is what would happen.
So thank you for this, because you had another slide where you said, we're healthy, but we have some decisions we have to make in the future. And lo and behold, here's one decision we could make and the impact it would have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Councillor Elgar?
Thank you, through Chair Mark. Jonathan, is there any way we can do a nice Coles Notes version of what has happened with parkland dedication and what the cost is to try to keep the level that we are used to in Oakville going forward?
Through you, Chair Grant, just you're looking for a Coles Notes version of maybe like the history of parkland dedication?
So that something we can explain to the residents where we're going and why it's happening. And it isn't because of us. I know it's because of the province, but we've got to get stuff out, information out there to the people so they understand what is taking place and why. I've noticed we're, what's 200 million or something with parks we're going to spend. Like, when you start trying to put a daisy chain together of why all of a sudden are there going to be no parks hardly in Midtown, and a kid, you can go to the new eco park or whatever on a tricycle, but a little kid at 3 years of age and 4 not going to make it. So I'm just trying to understand so people realize what is happening, that it's not our doing, but it's happening. And I must say what the CAO closely sends out every month is really helpful on how development charges really are not helping the existing residents of Oakville, how they're subsidizing and the subsidizing keeps increasing. To me, that's very important going forward.
Through you, Chair Grant, that's certainly something we can take back and think about the right information to include in something like that in the right format so residents are aware of the items that you've just touched on.
Thank you very much.
And that's probably something we can cover when we get to that portfolio later on in the week. Councillor O'Meara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question, Jonathan, with regards to the correlation between inflation rates, and I've already had questions about a lot of the tax bills were sent out in the past few days that residents now are seeing what they're got to pay for the rest of the year and for the beginning, and then it will be retroactive based upon our decisions here. We didn't charge residents 8% inflation when it was at in 22, and we can't go down to 1.6% or whatever it is today. And we hit this number in the middle. Can you just take a minute and explain, how we factor in inflation rates, though it's not the extremes that we see from a year to year, and maybe how that factors into how we come up with the numbers, and obviously the mayor's direction of 4%, but how we tie that to inflation, but we don't just knee-jerk react, well, hey, this quarter came up and that's what it is, so let's revise all of our numbers here. Can you maybe just explain that at a high level for us?
Certainly, through you, Chair Grant. And actually, if I could get slide 36 brought up, that will probably help visualize what I'll try to say. There we go. Perfect. So, as Councillor O'Meara stated, that we did have inflation at 8%, and we didn't have taxes at 8%. There's always a bit of a lag. I shouldn't say always. There's often a bit of a lag because a lot of the items that we do are multi-year, or they're for the long-term focus. So when you think about things like union negotiations or contracted services for snow removal or things like that, they're often done in a number of covering a number of years. So you want to focus on taking an average. You don't want to negotiate one of those contracts when it's at 8%. And nor does the vendor want to negotiate when it's at 1%. So you're trying to take that long-term focus. It's part of the reason the Bank of Canada has a target of 1 to 3% as what they're aiming at, is to try to create that stability. So when you look at the chart that's on the screen, you can see we were actually quite low the year that inflation was quite high. But as we've signed new union agreements, or if we've signed new contracts, we have to absorb the fact that they were signed at a time when inflation was higher, and those take a while to work their way through the economy, through our budgets, And that's why you're trying to avoid the peaks and the valleys and trying to stay a little bit more level as you kind of wrestle with inflation, especially when you've got like a massive peak like that and then a drop. And just to add to that, we get the same question on the fact that inflation numbers are coming in lower. We have to explain this story of the fact that it's taking a longer term view. It's looking at the past number of years as one of the variables we have to think about.
Great, and Councillor Haslett-Thiel.
Thank you, through Chair Grant. Thank you very much for another amazing presentation. A couple points of clarification, which maybe we'll get in the next couple of days. Can you just tell us what percentage of the increase is based on the contractual obligations we've had through negotiations?
Through you, Chair Grant. So what percentage of the overall increase is due to contractual obligations, like for union agreements?
Correct.
We would have to take and actually calculate that number. I think our last ones were around 3%, but what that works out to as a percentage of the whole, I don't know off the top of my head. We would have to calculate that.
Okay, that'd be helpful for us to have. Thank you. I'm also wanted to go back to, I think it's slide, I think I've got it right, slide 39 or 40.
Is it on the strat plan items for next year?
It's the council strategic plan deferred
Yep.
business cases. So I just wanted to get a bit more clarification on, are these incorporated in 2025? Could you just go back over that for me?
Certainly, through you, Chair Grant. So these items are not in 25. So these are items that staff raised throughout the budget process to say these are things that are important to address council's strategic priorities. However, not everything can make it into the budget. So what we did is we took this list here and we've actually added it into the projection for 2026 to say these are key things that we expect to be evaluated in next year's budget to address those key concerns, initiatives, risks, whatever they might be. But we wanted to highlight them for council based on the conversation we had at the June Budget Committee meeting, where there was a desire to see which, I'm going to simplify it here, which items made it in and which items didn't, and kind of where is that line. So these were the ones that didn't make it in for this year, but are important that we wanted to highlight that they should be considered for next year.
Okay, so for further clarification, this is when the departments make their submission to ELT and yourself, and they're saying we would require or need these additional headcounts, for example, in order to deliver the services that, is it new services or the current services?
Through you, Chair Grant, I think there would be a variety of rationale that goes into some of these. Some of them are tied to specific initiatives from council, things that have been put forward. Some of them are tied kind of more generally to council's overall objectives for growth management or community belonging, for example. I wouldn't want to, say they're all one or another. I think we'd have to evaluate them on their merits.
Okay, so so they are not in the budgets in front of us. You anticipate they may need to be in the 2026
Correct.
Budget, and is that and therefore that larger percentage increase that you forecasted for 2026 incorporates all of this additional headcount?
Correct. So if I go back a slide here, you'll see that there's a line called Council Strategic Priorities in the 26, like for those items.
Okay, so and maybe the CAO can answer this for us. So on, or Jonathan, will the commissioner speak to items that are not incorporated into what they're requesting and how they intend to manage through without that additional support or the impact of that?
I can do it.
And I'm certainly in no way saying I agree or disagree with this. I just want to understand.
So through you, Chair Grant, the primary focus of the commissioner presentations will be on the items that are in the budget and the forecast. So they won't specifically touch on these, but we're certainly going to provide that list to council. So should you have a question on them, there would be an opportunity to ask that question. I don't know if Commissioner or CAO Closey wants to add anything to that. No?
Right, thanks very much. My last question is just around user fees. So when will we discuss user fees? Rates and fees.
Through you, Chair Grant, are you talking about specific user fees, or are you talking about the overall policy approach that we take to including them in the budget?
Specific user fees.
I would suggest, through you, Chair Grant, I would suggest that if there were specific ones, it might be a good opportunity at the commissioner presentations to ask which ones those might be. And then depending on the nature of the question, we could either answer right away or report back later on. It would just depend on the nature of the question.
Okay. So maybe out of consideration of whoever's going to come up and talk about roads and Windrow, I'd like to understand how we have an 80.4% increase when a service was initially designed to support those that are challenged or senior, and all of a sudden we are now about to introduce potentially a dramatic increase to those folks who truly do need the support. So if somebody can give us that data when you come to give the commission, I'd appreciate it. So would those folks who can't afford an 80.4% increase. Thank you.
And I will point out that we will be discussing rates and fees at 5.3 today on our agenda. Also, this would be a good point to mention once again to councillors that the week of November 4th, you can go and talk to the Budget Committee to do a deep dive on any specific concerns that you do have. Without the constraints of the timing of a meeting like this, you can at least explore this and get the answers live from the actual people who are making these decisions. So remember, the week of November 4th. I'll be announcing that again, I'm sure. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Vanderheiden. I believe we're hearing from Director Clark next.
Okay, good morning. I'll be walking you through the Office of the CAO budget, which has 3 program areas. Just give me one sec. There we go. Administrative Executive Leadership, which is on tab 18. The Corporate Strategy and Government Relations program area on tab 20, and Business Support Services on tab 27. So these 2 program areas fit under 2 roles. Combined, though, the role of these program areas is really to advance council directives and deliver quality services. And we do that through a number of services. The administration of the executive leadership team includes guiding important decisions, managing priorities, and addressing issues to achieve council's goals. We lead, manage, or partner on key initiatives, including climate action. We undertake policy research and analysis to support our advocacy efforts. We support commissions and departments in delivering business solutions and continuous improvement projects. And we provide GIS, data management analytics, and data visualization. I would like to briefly touch on a few accomplishments from 2024. I do hope you bear with me. There will be some repetition from last night, but given we may have a different public audience, I would like to go over some of those items again. So as we discussed last night, 2 key roles of the town in climate action are to set the stage for the use of green technology and to promote energy literacy. And 2 areas on this slide demonstrate this. The district energy feasibility study for the hospital district was completed and represents a big step in our climate action journey in addressing emissions from buildings. and this will be a continued priority for us in 2025. We also focused on climate action, education, and outreach with campaigns and tools to help the public understand actions that they can take to support our community's GHG and energy reductions. We finalized our multi-year inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility plan, as well as a subset action with the development of the accessibility plan. And by year end, we will have a procedure to address when the town responds publicly to IDEA-related issues, events, or requests for action. We also launched the town's Data Hub, which is a centralized location for reporting on key metrics about the town's performance and future growth planning. And on the continuous improvement front, we completed or launched 10 Greenbelt projects, and I've shown 3 examples of those here. And you will hear more about this in the commission presentations, but as a teaser, our tree permit lien review has returned all services and applications to within the service standard, which is a great example of how simplifying processes can help us deal with volumes. And one further point I would like to make on continuous improvement. As you heard from both the CAO and our Director of Finance, as a growing municipality, the focus on streamlining our processes is crucial as our demands continue to grow. This is not about finding staff reductions. It's about ensuring our processes are crisp and clear to handle increasing workloads before we consider new requests for staff. I've also mentioned before that this is difficult work, and we are being very intentional with our process reviews. Training is targeted on Council's strategic plan objectives and known pain points for our residents, businesses, and employees. For our key metrics, this is a sampling, and the 5-year trends can be found in the business plans under the tabs that I noted earlier. Our community satisfaction survey, which was held in February and March of this year, showed 89% satisfaction with the quality of services provided by the town. You also heard last night about our progress against our 2030 GHG and energy reduction targets and how that continues. And I will note these are the results from 2023. We do not receive in-year information on these, and we'll report back next year on those. I also wanted to note that the results do vary year over year, and that variation is due to a variety of factors, including things like weather severity, but also the pandemic shutdowns, where our facilities were closed, has obviously done an unusual increase in our savings, which isn't, of course, standard. And we introduced a new measure this year for tracking completion against Council's 4-year action plan, which measures what we said we were going to do versus what was actually accomplished. We do not expect results to ever reach 100%, and that's due to unexpected or changing circumstances that impact or require adjustments to our work plan. And right now we are tracking to a 76% completion rate. And finally, our staff turnover rate, which is included under Administrative Executive Leadership's business plan, is currently at 4.4%. I do want to note that is up until August, and we are projecting that turnover will be in the range of 7% is what we're projecting. So this slide outlines the key influences that we assess and consider as we develop the budget. Last year, this was referred to as the watch list. And these are the trends and what we're hearing from the community. So as we know, climate impacts are increasing, and the organization is assessing on how to best manage these impacts. More and more surveys are pointing to climate action as a pressing concern among the public, particularly the youth. In our own community survey, sustainable development standards was the third most important consideration at 23% for growth and land use planning, which was only behind protecting the character of our existing neighborhoods and having diverse housing options. Global surveys are also showing increasing public concern with results, including the Canadian subsection of those results, highlighting the need for more protection against climate-related impacts. Legislative changes will continue, and we need to keep a close eye on potential changes that could stem from an anticipated federal and possibly provincial election. And related to this, having strong government relations and being able to advocate for Oakville's interests is becoming ever more important as we rely on those other levels of government for both funding and action. And the need for higher levels of government to assist municipalities in meeting its financial pressures highlights the importance of quality data analysis and performance metrics, which is increasingly required for us to access these federal and provincial funding opportunities. Our community also told us that the availability of online services needs improvement. And finally, over the last few years, we completed department assessments of all of our departments to ensure that we're focused on the right things and have the capacity to deliver on our programs and our services. This work confirmed that we are exceptionally focused on service delivery. However, it also identified the need to layer in capacity for strategic thinking to support operational delivery and to understand and plan for the changes ahead. So what does all of this mean for our 2025 work plan and budget? For climate action, district energy will continue to be a key focus for us as we work with OEC. We will develop an organization-wide electric vehicle plan, which covers both the criteria for when to switch to electric alternatives, as well as assigning a value to the climate benefits that can be gained, and determining our ongoing role in providing EV charging across the town. Also, as mentioned last night, we are partnering with planning services to develop green development standards, including options for council consideration to incent the adoption of those standards. And the business support units, they work with commissions and departments to deliver service improvements. And I've provided some examples here, including implementation of E-Plan for the review and circulation in the development approval process. And you will hear more about that from Acting Commissioner Kaminsky in his presentation on Thursday. We, of course, will continue to oversee the organization's progress in implementing the IDEA plan. And we will have our first report back to Council in 2025. And for these program areas, because this work is across the organization, we are also working on a recognition procedure to ensure a consistent approach in determining what gets recognized. And that includes things like our lighting, our signs, our banners, and markers on our staff uniforms. And finally, I'd like to flag upcoming work for an online service standard and qualification criteria. This is a tool that will assess if a service meets the qualifications to move online, along with a standard method to do so, which makes for a more consistent customer experience. And we are also running 3 green belts as part of our larger employee life cycle program. So that includes on, cross, and offboarding. So as people onboard into the town, as they exit the town, but also if they move positions within the town, we are looking at reviewing the processes associated with that. And I also wanted to note that that will be done in-house by one of our black belt trained staff, which reduces our cost and reliance on external consultants. And so if you recall from previous budget presentations, we've been putting a lot of effort into our lean training. There are several levels of training that goes into that, and we now have 3 black belt trained staff across in the organization. So for the overall budget, our operating falls 100% under the accountable government priority, and capital is a mix of accountable government and environmental sustainability. We represent 2% of the overall operating budget. And this shows the tax levy by tax levy by program. The increases for business support services and corporate strategy and government relations, the increases are primarily due to staff realignments from other areas in the organization, as well as annualized costs associated with approvals done in 2024. And there is a new staff request that I'll speak to shortly, and new operating dollars for contracted services included in this. And for administrative executive leadership, the increase is primarily due to the removal of a transfer from tax stabilization reserve for efficiencies. So to recap, I mentioned we have a new FTE request. That was a deferral from the 2024 budget that is so we talk about business support services providing support to commissions and departments to make the changes that they need in terms of their online, but also to serve as a capacity for our corporate priorities, which include things like the IDEA program, the digital program. They also work on, the position would also work on improvement plans, as well as complex issues and complaint management for commissioners. So these are those complaints that don't easily fall within the service Oakville service model. It often crosses departments, requires work to figure out the true issue, what's going on there. And so they would support the commissioner in responding to those as well. The $50,000 in annual contracted services is to fund ongoing continuous improvement to various technology. This is primarily associated with our Amanda platform that supports development application, and that's to ensure that we have that existing funding source to make ongoing improvements. Regarding our capital budget overview, this shows the proportion against the overall, and this shows the breakdown by the program area. And the recommended capital budget includes the following requests that are identified here. For capital, there is a planned update to the community energy strategy that will cover the next 5 years, as well as a planned payment to Future Energy Oakville. We have funding for our continuous improvement program, as well as pre-work on the 2026 community, should say community survey. And I would like to note, while the Downtown Cultural Hub is noted here, Commissioner Damaso will speak to that in his presentation. So with that, that includes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And our first questioner is Councillor Duddick.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. In your presentation, you referenced two things that give me concern. One is the 4.4 turnover rate for staff, and the other one is the employee life cycle. I know that we're surveying the public for their satisfaction. What kind of work are we doing in terms of our employee satisfaction?
So I'll start first with the answer to the turnover rate at 4.4%. I did note that was up until the end of August, and we do expect that the actual annual rate will likely trend closer to 7%. And the employee satisfaction, so that's a great question. We do survey our employees, and we have We've done pulse surveys over the last few years, which are shorter shorter surveys that offer a snapshot of the employee experience. In December of this year, it's late November, December of this year, we are going to release a larger employee survey to get a little more insight into how our employees are feeling and doing and how engaged they are. So that is coming up shortly.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now Councillor Nanda.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Grant. And continuing to what Councillor Dudek was saying, I think we've noticed with some of the turnover, there's been some high-level positions, retirements, and so forth. So how is the hiring process going for that? Because it's not easy to find commissioners, directors, and so forth, you know, so easily as they're phasing out now. So what are we doing with that process?
I'm going to invite Director Ashmore to come down. While she's coming here, I will say, you know, turnover is a bit of an art and a science. You don't want it too low, you don't want it too high. There is a healthy amount of turnover to bring new ideas into the organization. But in terms of how the recruitment is going and the market, I will ask Director Ashmore to respond to that.
Good morning, Mayor and Council, and through you, Chair Grant. We certainly, like other organizations, have felt the labor pressures in the labor market and have continued to mitigate and to help our departments with that recruitment process. So has been a challenge for a few of our positions, for sure, but overall, I think we are holding our own. For the most part, I will say that industry, I was just reading an article from Mercer recently that Canadian turnover is around 11%. So overall, we are similar to other organizations experiencing those challenges and doing our best to mitigate those through attraction and recruitment efforts.
So maybe CAO closely could answer this. Are you feeling a lot of pressure with other employees having to have added work without these positions being in place?
Through you, Chair Grant, of course you can never work the same way with less staff, so yes, there is pressure. We have, I think, shifted around those pressures as much as we can through acting roles in order to be able to carry on until we have some of those positions filled.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the satisfaction survey that was done through the public, can you tell us how many people actually did the survey?
Oh, that so the phone survey, it was in the 800s, I believe, of respondents. I would have to check the notes at the beginning of the survey on that, but there were approximately, it might be 805, but 800 respondents through that. And then we also have a voluntary survey, which is not statistically significant, and I believe that it was between 1 and 2,000. I think it was around 1,500. I'm going to go right in the middle on that one.
So we're looking at a very, very low percentage of the population actually doing the surveys.
Well, the important part on that is the statistically significant. So it is a random sampling of the public, and it is, I believe the results, again, this is in the survey, is around a 2 to 3% margin of error on that. But we rely on the phone one and not the voluntary. The voluntary tends to be either really good or really bad. It's the telephone survey that gives you that statistically significant result.
And do you have stats on satisfaction between different departments? Is there one department that has higher satisfaction over another one?
So it doesn't rate departments per se, it rates programs and services. So our parks and trails, for example, trends higher than the 89%. I believe
No surprise.
the result was 94% for this year. Rec and Culture is also in there. I believe they're in the high 80s. So it does reference the different, a number of different services, not all.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to turn over to, can you just quickly explain the mobile inspection app for permits?
That one, I'm going to have Commissioner Kaminsky speak to that in his presentation on Thursday.
Okay, so I had a question based on that. I'll leave that for Thursday. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Haslett-Thiel.
Thank you, Chair Grant, through you. Thank you for your presentation. What is our current vacancy rate?
Through you, Councillor Grant. We're sitting around 79 positions right now that are vacant. In terms of a percentage, I'd have to do that calculation.
And can you reflect on how that trends against last year and the year before?
It's pretty, it tends to be around that. Positions get filled and then we have vacancies and they kind of move around. We have some positions that have come out of the budget process that we're still in the process of filling. And so that is a combined, and I certainly can take a look at that for our discussions.
It seems like a very high number and would speak to maybe some possible pressure points depending on how it's spread across departments, et cetera, which I'm sure you're monitoring and assessing. My other question is just around that benchmark, that Mercer benchmark. Was that a municipal benchmark or was that corporate benchmark?
The Mercer benchmark that I did was across Canada based on 1,100 organizations that they surveyed. So it's a Canadian-wide turnover rate.
But it's not municipal government specific?
Not specifically, no.
Is there municipal government specific data that you could share with us that, because I mean really who we typically pull from or poach from, so a little advertising, we're a great place, come work here. That would be the benchmark, I think, that would really reflect how are we doing against other municipalities.
Yeah, certainly I can take a look at that. I would say that across our municipalities and at the AMO discussions that have been happening, many municipalities are experiencing the same thing. We all had a bubble of people that were ready to retire, and so we are certainly all in the same sort of experience at the moment. But that actual rate, I'm certainly happy to get back to you about.
Thank you for that. And so that projected 7% turnover includes retirees by the end of the year. So is that like 2.5% of what's going to occur this year? And how does that compare to last year?
Off the top of my head, I don't have that number available, but I'm happy to provide it and share that number, the breakdown.
The reason I'm asking is I want to come back to a question I've asked in prior years about succession planning and about leadership development. In this budget, is there work around and more focused efforts on ensuring people are ready to take on leadership roles and that we're prepared for future retirees?
Yes, certainly there is. We've drafted a people plan that we've been working on, and within that, we've been talking about succession for leadership positions. It's one of our priorities that we are working on and is projected in the budget.
Okay. Do we have a external exit interview consultant, somebody who they can confidentially do exit interviews and put all the data together and give us that objective feedback that is sometimes hard to hear?
Yes. Certainly in 2024, we did launch an exit survey program using a third party through McLean & Company to help us gather that information. So we're still in the process of gathering it right now, but we are undertaking that.
And is the data, when an individual chooses to submit, is it anonymous?
It is. They then can choose to share that data if they wish with us.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's all my HR type questions. Other than I would like to understand what what the complaints head count is going to do.
Oh, so that position, in last year's budget, we created a small team to support the corporate services and community services commissions to help them, to give capacity primarily to continuous improvement projects. One of the slides noted that we are tremendously focused on the doing and the delivering of the service, and sometimes making the changes to those or improvements is a lot harder to do when you're delivering at the same time. It was a team of 2. This now increases it to 3. That position is going to do what I would call the softer side of services for the commissioners, as well as the directors. So it is to help with things like their improvement plans, prioritizing what needs to get done, working on the corporate priority projects that then come out of corporate strategy and government relations to support idea implementation, for example. And then the last piece was we have been, it's anecdotal, this trend of complex responses that are coming into the CAO's office. Sometimes they come in through Service Oakville, but not always. They're not necessarily an immediate service response. And the issue can often cross departments. And so we spend a tremendous amount of time trying to figure out between multiple people, what is the actual question being asked? Who's tracking down an answer? If it's coming from multiple areas, is it a coordinated answer that makes sense to the resident? So that's what I'm referring to when we talk about complex issues management. More and more we're seeing these questions come in that we have found it very difficult in coordinating an answer to that. And so this position would support the commissioners in doing that and tracking it down and ensuring that the answer is coming out in a timely way, and that weeks aren't passing as we're trying to gather the response. Often it sits with directors, which is not a great use of their time.
So thank you for that explanation, because I think that clears up a lot of the puzzled looks, like what is this going to do? And is it going to report into Service Oakville, or be part of Service Oakville as a higher level, sort of this is coming in, this is more complex, or is it separated out from it?
So the position will report into the Business Support Services Unit, but the work of those units, they do work closely with Service Oakville. So there will be a connection there.
That's an interesting organizational design, but I will leave that. Thanks very much for your time and your presentation today.
Thank you. Councillor Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a comments with respect to the questions that are being asked, and I understand the challenge we have with our FTEs, but I'm really concerned about the vacancy rate and the gapping and acting positions all rolled into one, and the challenges we're having with this. And I think it has extreme pressure on our existing staff. It would be, I know, and the question was asked about exit interviews. That information would be prevalent for us to have some kind of information on that. But there seems to be some concern in the culture of our organization that we're having some real stress points, and I think that's been noted by even with the CAO making those comments to me in the past meetings. So I would like to see a lot more attention put on that area, because I think, as you're saying, we're growing, we're moving forward, but unfortunately, our people side is becoming extremely difficult, and I don't know why. And I would ask. I know we're in budget, but I would ask on a regular basis we have some information, update information on vacancies and gapping and acting positions and status, because it seems that we're gonna hit the wall sometimes, and council's not even aware of that. So I think that's really important as part of the information provided to council, that this be a, real time. So I just leave it as that, but I think we need to look at the whole, FTEs and where we're at, and how that equates to our initiatives and our strategic directions for the town. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that comment, and we will certainly consider options for that.
Great, that seems to have exhausted all of our questions, so we will see from Commissioner Sully now.
I'm just waiting for the presentation. Thank you. Through you, Chair Grant, I'm pleased to present the Corporate Services Commission budget for 2025. So this slide shows the tabs where the 7 program areas within corporate services can be found in the budget document. I'll be speaking to each of them in my presentation. They represent 6 departments with the addition of our Communications and Customer Experience Department, which was added to corporate services this year. The mandate of corporate services is to strengthen, support, and protect the organization. We do this by offering critical, strategic, and administrative support and processes that are aligned with legislation. We're in the background ensuring that the town's corporate, legal, procedural, technological, and labor responsibilities are met. We also provide multi-channel proactive communications, community engagement, and innovative and accessible customer service. So I wanted to highlight some of the accomplishments in our Corporate Services Commission this year. The first one is the property tax software implementation. This software, which will go live later this year, replaces a legacy tax system. And one of the key features of it that they're most excited about is the online tax portal, which will allow residents and property owners to access their tax information online. This is expected to be launched in early 2025, but we are going to offer council a sneak preview of the portal later this year. With the increasing cybersecurity threats, I think everyone has heard them in the news. We've seen how it's affected some of our neighboring municipalities. This has been a key focus in our commission. In fact, October is Cyber Awareness Month, and you may have seen some emails from our ITS security team with tips on how to protect yourself and the town. This year, we continue to implement our cyber risk mitigation strategy. One of the initiatives in the strategy was the completion of incident response playbooks to support quick response to security incidents in order to effectively and efficiently help minimize damage, improve recovery time, restore business operations, and mitigate any financial impacts. There's been a bit of mention about our 5-year people plan. Susan mentioned it just a few minutes ago. That plan has been prepared, it's in draft, but it's ready for consultation and for implementation next year. The people plan outlines what our leaders across the organization will undertake in partnership with and with the support of our Human Resources Department to advance the objectives of Council's strategic plan. It is a commitment to a productive and healthy workplace, one where we can all experience physical and mental well-being, recognitions, and opportunities to thrive in our career. And earlier this year, we completed the rollout of Office 365 to all staff. Some of the benefits of having Office 365 is the standardization, as now everyone is using the same software. There's real-time collaboration, cloud file storage that allows access anywhere, and improve security. We've also been undertaking our bylaw search and findability project. We're later, probably into the new year, we'll be launching a custom-built search and browse bylaw page that meets accessibility requirements and improves the relevancy of search results. We've also made some improvements behind the scenes to administrative processes, the development of a bylaw management system, and standard operating procedures. We're also wrapping up phase 1 of our land acquisition and disposition strategy. This phase will result in an inventory of surplus or underutilized properties so that we can determine whether they're ready for disposition or can be leveraged in some other manner. It'll also look at some of the needs that have been identified through master plans and the various budgets. An accessible PDF strategy was developed to assist in meeting AODA requirements for the town's website. And under community belonging, I did want to highlight that earlier this year we replaced our council chamber audio with a new simplified system that streamlines our audio within the chamber to improve quality and reliability. We also completed the 2024 to 2029 multi-year accessibility plan. This was on council's agenda last night and builds on the past achievements and outlines actions to help the town continue to meet or exceed AODA requirements. And we've also updated our online services page to improve customer experience, making it easier for customers to find services they need. And we've added knowledge articles to help customers with their submissions. Our legal services team supports growth management in the town, and including support on development of significant planning and other initiatives, of which has been many this past year. This highlights some of the KPIs in our program areas. As Julie mentioned, the budget document, each business plan has our KPIs and shows the trends over a 5-year period. I did want to highlight our clean audits for 2020 to 2023, and we expect no difference for this coming year. And also the 88% of citizens who felt the town information was easy to understand. So there are many influences on the budget that we've had to consider as we've prepared the budget for the corporate services programs. I've already mentioned the increasing cyber risk. You'll see several initiatives in the budget to address this increasing threat. The attraction and retention of our workforce continues to be of concern, and I know this morning there's been quite a bit of discussion on that. Considerable work on attraction and retention has been undertaken this year, and the budget includes resources to assist in moving forward on actions to support our employees. In this past year, we've identified some recruitment branding materials and also worked on a succession management framework. Data management and the use of data is critical to the town as we move forward. We need to ensure we have accurate, easily accessible data to ensure our programs and services operate in the most efficient and effective manner. And we continue to respond to changes in legislation. Both CAO Cloesy and our Director of Finance mentioned the changes to the Development Charge Act that has significantly impacted our long-term capital planning. We continue to improve our website in compliance with AODA and implement internal processes and policies to ensure compliance with privacy legislation. This becomes increasingly critical as we move more and more services online. And as Julie mentioned, our citizen survey findings indicated that one of the primary areas of improvement for the town is the availability of online services. We continue to look at improvements. As I mentioned, we launched our online services page this year, and we will be launching our tax portal next year. And last but not least is financial sustainability. As the town grows and the demand for services and facilities increases, our long-term financial planning ensures our financial position continues to remain strong. By proactively planning over the long term, exploring new funding sources, we'll continue to meet the needs of our growing community. So I wanted to highlight some of the items or actions that we're going to undertake next year as part of the Corporate Services Work Plan. The first is enterprise data management. This program has moved into our ITS department. We hope to finalize the recruitment of 2 key positions to bring this project forward. That should happen by the end of the year, and we'll begin implementing the plan next year. AI is top of mind for many of our departments, and as we look for opportunities to use AI in the town, we will be developing guidelines to support efficient, effective use and protection of our information and data. We'll also continue work on our 2025 cybersecurity initiative. There are several initiatives that are planned for next year and included in the budget. Those include a remote access solution, security awareness training, an enterprise vulnerability management program, disaster recovery consulting, and multi-factor authentication. And we'll be undertaking phase 2 of the land acquisition study. This will build on the work completed in phase 1 and help us determine when and how the town should explore value enhancement opportunities. We'll be launching our new bylaw search page. And although the next municipal election is not until 2026, next year our clerk's team will be planning for that election. Some of the things that will need to come to council for consideration include alternative voting methods and our contribution rebate program. We'll also be updating our procedure bylaw and council code of conduct. We are looking to expand Salesforce into transit, building services, and recreation and culture next year. The implementation of a CRM in those departments will help support efficient and effective customer service. And the development of a customer experience strategy is currently underway, with implementation planned for next year. The focus of this strategy is on ensuring our lines of business are centered around the resident wherever possible and are seamless and digitally enabled. And finally, our public identity and access management program continues with implementation. Under growth management, legal services will continue to support development of significant planning and other initiatives, as well as support the defense and advancing the town's interest in planning and other appeals. Commissioner Fu will highlight the implementation of the ASE program and the resources required for it in her presentation. I did want to highlight that dispute resolution for that program lies within our legal services department, and we'll be undertaking that next year. A community engagement program will be developed next year to provide additional tools and improve our resident engagement. And human resources will continue to support the implementation of action items in the multi-year IDEA plan. So I want to turn to our 2025 proposed budget. The net operating budget for corporate services programs is $37.1 million. 88% of this supports accountable government, 12% community belonging. We have a very small capital program of just over $4 million, and this supports accountable government. We represent 9% of the overall gross operating budget, or 13% of the net operating budget. This highlights the 2025 proposed tax levy by program and also shows you the 2024 levy for comparison purposes. Most of our program areas are going up by inflation, but I did want to highlight a couple of areas. The first is communications and customer experience. This is a new department that was created in 2024, and 3 positions were included in the 2024 budget to support the department, including a new director and 2 web editors. Those positions have been annualized in our 2025 budget. In legal, the hearing officers to support the ASE implementation and expanding parking enforcement program are included. And in human resources, resources to support strategic priorities such as workforce planning and IDEA. And in ITS, the main driver of the increase is in our purchased services, and this relates to software maintenance and software as a service. More and more of our software is in the cloud, and that creates operating impacts as we pay those annual subscription fees. This year, with our tax software coming on board, as well as Office 365, they're the main drivers of that increase. So we have included some resources in the budget for 2025, and that's to ensure that we have the capacity to meet the needs of the organization as we move forward. The first is in human resources, a consultant HR strategy and program development. This will enhance the capacity for strategic support to departments and employees, including the 5-year people plan. We've also included funding for the implementation of HR-related outcomes of the IDEA plan. In legal services, I've already mentioned a screening officer. This will support timely dispute resolution processes under the administrative penalty system. And in information technology and systems, there's funding for security awareness training. This is a key defense in securing our network and systems. And in political governance, a legislative compliance specialist, which will support web content accessibility, as well as town compliance with provincial accessibility legislation. Our capital budget is very small in comparison to the overall capital program, representing just 2%. The main focus of our capital program is cybersecurity and risk management, as well as the expansion of Salesforce to support improved customer service and infrastructure renewal and IT assets. I want to highlight just a couple of projects in our program. The first is our infrastructure renewal. This is for new and replacement technology across the organization to ensure that our programs and services can be operated efficiently and effectively. We've also included funding in 2026 to undertake a community benefit charge and a development charge study. With the completion of master plans, and some have been completed, some are near finalization, we'll need to do our background studies to update them to ensure that we're accounting for all of the needs that have been identified and ensure that we can fund the growth to the highest extent possible. So that work is planned to begin next year. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Councillor Knoll, there we go. There's a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to the cyber risk mitigation programs, I know we've had briefings in the past, and I do know that it's an increasing threat across government, NGO, and corporate environments. Can we get a briefing, not during the budget cycle, but can we get a briefing as to where we stand on this to update councils? A key part of our role, of course, is managing risk as well. So I'd be very curious to understand what this program that we're investing so much in looks like and what the progress is.
Through you, Chair Grant, yes, we are planning to do a workshop with council either later this year or early next year to provide you with information on our cybersecurity risk plan, what we're doing, what we need to do to protect the organization. So that is upcoming.
Have we, on that same topic, have we considered engaging our auditor in doing a third-party audit of our cybersecurity planning? Because I know that's a service that most of the large accounting houses are offering, or do we have an alternative external monitoring protocol?
We have, in past, hired a consultant to look at our cybersecurity practices. I know the auditors do offer that service, and we are looking at it. And we'll make a decision on that. But yes, we are looking into that.
Thank you. I appreciate the emphasis on this. You are very correct. We've had a number of our neighboring communities have significant impacts through this, and I think it's every dollar spent on protecting our IT infrastructure is a dollar well spent. Moving on to SaaS, you mentioned it during the presentation. Have we seen a complete rollout of SaaS software now, or do we still have more to come? And if so, do we have that built into our forecast going forward?
We haven't had a complete rollout of it. We are shifting more and more to the cloud for various reasons. Most software vendors now, when you buy the product, is on the cloud. So we are looking at that as we go forward. Our long-term capital plan looks at that, but that will be ongoing.
So you're saying the long-term capital program looks at that. Isn't SaaS something that's picked up through operating and not capital?
Well, it is, but as we develop the capital program and replace software by new software through the capital program, then there are the operating impacts ongoing for the software as a service. So that it's driven by the capital investment.
Right. Presumably, if all of our software is going to SaaS, we'll no longer see software in that capital projection, I would guess.
You'll see the initial purchase or implementation, but you're right, it'll be in the it'll shift to the operating budget.
Okay, shifting to enforcement, I don't need to go to the dashboard slide, but it referenced 93% of successful enforcement. Can you just maybe expand on what that means?
That means when, let me just find it here. The measure is in the business plan, which will explain it better, but in the cases where we have had to do enforcement, we've been successful through prosecutions 93% of the time.
Okay, so this is a success at the prosecutorial level.
It is.
And what do we have a good idea? Do we have any sense of where we fell down on the other 7% of the time?
I'd have to get back to you on that.
One of the things I'm really looking to drill into here is, would any of that 7% be impacted by our disastrous courthouse in Milton? I'd be curious if I'd like to know that piece as we continue to build our case for trying to get the province to actually give us a habitable and useful courthouse.
We'll provide some information on what has driven that and report back.
Just as a point of interest, council members might be interested in reading a story in the Toronto Star today about a judge that is being investigated due to reactions to the courthouse. This situation gets worse every day. I'd be curious if this impacts our municipal enforcement. Thank you very much for the presentation. Well done.
Thank you. And now Councillor O'Meara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, you don't have to go back to the slide, but it was on slide 5 where you had talked about land acquisition and disposition of land. Is that something that our MDC does, or do we do that, or what's the role of our Municipal Development Corporation with regards to the buying and disposition of land?
So this study is to really look at our inventory of land and what we need, what we don't need, that's surplus, and then we would work with MDC on either the disposition of that land or maximizing its value, leveraging it through joint ventures. So this is kind of a database for us to then leverage MDC.
Okay, so they would be involved in the acts, but we don't know what land we have or what land we need. Is that kind of?
No, we do, but we're just doing a really formal process to keep an up-to-date inventory on that to efficiently manage our resources.
Okay. And then my second and last question is, it has to do with MES and with, in particular, our after-hours program. And I know we're going to look at Salesforce and we're going to have bylaw pages and these sorts of things, but from a customer service standpoint, I think a lot of residents call and, depending on how things get dispersed, depending on whether officers are busy, it's really out into the abyss. And they're not sure, from a customer service standpoint, I think we're missing that constant connection. An officer has been dispatched. An officer won't get there until, here's the fault. So I don't know where the technology is. I don't think it's through a website. But are we looking at technology to keep communication with our residents, in particular with MES? Are we able to look into how we can keep people notified when it's not a Monday to Friday, and even in Monday to Friday sometimes that might be best. But are we able to explore avenues that sort of continue to keep our residents in the know when they're dealing with MES?
Through you, Chair, I'll take that just from recent transfer of responsibilities. So after hours is done through the call center. And I think perhaps the best, my suggestion would be that we do some type of report back to council on how the after hours service actually works and the connection into the Salesforce program. There is supposed to be entry in so that residents can see the status of their case and how it's going. It is designed to be seamless. Having said that, I do recognize that there have been several questions on potential gaps in after-hours service. So if that's okay, could we perhaps develop some type of formal response back to you?
No, absolutely, and I'm not expecting you to have the answers to that. It just seems like there are multiple pieces to this MES puzzle, and it seems like even in hours with Amanda, with Salesforce, with call centers, with websites, with the there's a bunch of things, and all residents really want at the end of the day is to know I've made a complaint. I know that they're following up with me, and I know once it's done, I'll be replied to. And I think however those things happen, when we approach this and our workload that Commissioner was explaining, I see we're working on a number of Salesforce, and so as long as we've got a view that we have to think about the resident first and how they're interacting, because we're going to play with the back end stuff, but they don't care about that. They just want to make sure that the input that they give, there's a proper output. So I'm happy to sort of figure out how we do that. But while we launch our plans and we're going to spend money on these things next year, that we're cognizant that needs to be at the forefront of all of the work that we ask consultants and people to do.
Through you, Mr. Chair, point taken. I will note it is one of the reasons why we want to do the online service standard that I spoke about in my presentation, which does speak to base criteria that needs to be ready before a service goes online, and taking that customer view from the start. You're correct. In the background, it's shifting from one application to another. It can get a little clunky. But agree, the resident does not care and should not care about how that works.
Thank you so much.
Let us take that back.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Seeing no further speakers, I have just one question myself to dovetail on what Councillor Knoll talked about, and you'd mentioned the meeting we may have later about security. During that meeting, it might be good also to discuss what we're prepared for in the case of a bug in the cloud itself. And I'm thinking of the CrowdStrike incident earlier this year where it was the software itself that let everybody down. If we're moving further and further into the cloud, it'd be nice to know what we're prepared for should something happen within that.
We'll ensure that's part of it.
Great. All right, so that is our last speaker. Thank you very much, Commissioner. That means that we can move to moving. And do we have somebody who'd like to move the operating and capital budget presentations receipts? There we go. I'll take Councillor Adams. Perfect. All in favor? That's accepted. Great. And this is a perfect time then for us to break for lunch. I like round numbers, so we'll come back at 1 o'clock. Oh, sorry. We have just one more question or thing from...
Chair Grant, actually, the items 5.2 and 5.3 I've touched on in my presentation. We probably just need receipt of those, and then you could probably actually adjourn. If there are no other questions.
Well, if we have movers for 5.2 and 5.3. Well, Councillor McNeice for 5.2. All in favor? All right. And 5.3, Councillor Shi. All in favor?
Mr. Chair, I have a question, sorry. On
okay,
5.3.
no problem. Let's go to...
And it won't be long, but I did wait until we got to the rates and fees because you had said we're going to get to the rates and fees. I'm just cognizant of we're continuing to make sure that the rates are being charged to the services that are delivered for whatever the issue is. Have we done a service review to see if we can also fix that balance as well? Do we need that level of service for some of the rates that we're charging? And just as so instead of them always going up, sometimes we try to balance and say maybe they don't need to be that high, because maybe we can mess with the service level a little. And I'll use this as a prime example. We had a 4-hour event in a park, and there was like a 2 garbage pickup that needed to happen, and then the rates had to pay for that, and the people using the park, well, we don't even need 2 garbage pickups. And so are we trying to figure out how we can also look at what are the service levels that we are mandating happening for these rates, and maybe we can try and fight those back on the other end, rather than always just raising the rates as costs go up?
Through you, Chair Grant, I'll start, and then maybe CAO Clohessy can jump in. So each year when we build out the budget and work with departments, they do take a look at everything that goes into their rates and fees. So they are looking at them. We have a number of models behind the scenes that we're looking to update the time that goes into certain parts of it. We don't do a fulsome deep dive every year. We kind of chip away at them as we go. But that is one of the considerations we do think about, and that's why sometimes fees change or don't change as we go through. There's a lot of work that goes into it, but I'll see if CAO Clohessy has anything to add to that.
Through you, Chair Grant, the only thing I'd add is I think you'll find that the Paul Damaso, the Commissioner in Community Services, will identify some of the service reviews they are going to be undertaking in Community Services Group. It is something that we look at across the corporation, areas that we might want to focus on from year to year. That is one area he's going to be looking at service level review.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions? All right, Councillor Shi has moved 5.3. All in favor? That moved. Great. Thank you for saving us so much time, Mr. Vanderheyden. Then I guess we've got no confidential discussion. We will adjourn, and we will see you all Thursday. Bring your blankies and slippers. It'll be a long one.